Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from today. My name is Abiodun. I serve as Executive Director of UWC International, and I'm very delighted to welcome you to the second session of the UWC Impact Talks. We established this series to bring together the people who are grappling with, in real terms, in practical time, the kinds of ideas and systems that are shaping our shared future, and to do so through the lens that has always defined UWC. The idea for us that education is not just about understanding the world, but about having the courage and the capacity to shape it for the better. Our theme today could not be more timely or more consequential. AI is reshaping our world, and so who gets to shape what comes next? I'm glad that you've joined us for this conversation, and I welcome you to begin to use the chat to tell us where in the world you have joined us from. And we will have a fantastic conversation today, and I hope you will participate fully in the discussion. Artificial intelligence is for us no longer a distant or speculative technology. It is already embedded in how we diagnose illnesses, how we teach and assess in our schools, how we distribute resources, how we make decisions about who gets to access what. AI is moving faster than most of our institutions can absorb, and it's moving faster than most of us at an individual level can keep pace with. And that speed is where the tension lies for us. We know that AI holds extraordinary promise in terms of how we access healthcare, how we personalize learning, how we solve problems at a scale that we've never been able to tackle before. But that same power to do so much good, if it is left unshaped and ungoverned, it risks concentrating decision-making in the hands of a few. We face the potential of entrenched bias. We might leave lots of communities, lots of perspectives out of the rooms in which we operate, based on the kinds of designs of the systems that we are using. And so the tension that we're grappling with today, AI as a force for good and AI as a force that can deepen inequality, is exactly where we believe that we have a role to play, especially as we think about the future of learning in our world. At UWC, our mission has always been to unite people, nations, and cultures for peace and a sustainable future. And we've strengthened this strategy or this focus in our most recent strategy. It brings our mission into clear context. We're committed to preparing young people not simply to adapt to the world as they find it, but to actively engage with and question and help to shape the systems that will define their generation. And so as young people move through our schools and colleges today, and as they imagine their future as policymakers, as civic leaders, as clinicians, and as engineers, people who would decide how the technologies of today govern tomorrow, we believe that we have a responsibility to help them to think about how best to maximize what AI can do, but to make sure that it is shaped by diverse voices and it's grounded in human values and that it genuinely serves humanity. And so our panel today will help us grapple with the realities of AI in the world as it is today, and also look forward to how we balance our value system, our mission competencies, our focus on helping to shape a more peaceful and sustainable world with all of the promises of AI. The people who have accepted to speak with us today span an extraordinary span of sectors. We think about AI governance, about digital health, about safety research, about education. I'm very excited for what they're going to bring to our discussion today, and I'd like to introduce them to you now. Gina Neff is a professor of responsible AI at Queen Mary University of London, and she's the chair of the Welsh Government's Strategic AI Advisory Group. And in that role, she helps to shape the responsible adoption of AI in public services and how work brings together technology, policy, and society to ensure that AI serves the public good, with a particular focus on governance, on education, and human-centered innovation. And Gina is also an alumna of UWC USA. It's a pleasure to have you, Gina.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
We also have Dr. Nada Abedin from Beust, who is the founder of X Medical, and she's working at the intersection of healthcare, AI, and digital innovation. She brings more than a decade of international clinical experience, and her work focuses on applying AI and digital health solutions in clinical settings that bridge the gap between healthcare, technology, and implementation. Nada, it's a huge privilege to have you in the chat today.
Thank you for having me. Very excited for this conversation.
Wonderful. Dr. Philipp Kellmeyer is a Junior Professor for Responsible AI and Digital Health at the University of Mannheim and is the head of the Human Technology Interaction Lab at the University Medical Center in Freiburg. And his research focuses on AI ethics, digital health, and the relationship between humans and emerging technologies. Phil, it's great to have you as well today.
Likewise. Thanks a lot and I look forward to it.
Brilliant. And Liha Leung is the AI Safety Research Fellow at Pivotal Research, where she works on questions relating to AI safety and the responsible development of advanced AI systems. And she holds a BSc in International Relations and History from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and she is an alumna of UWC Atlantic. It's wonderful to have you, Liha.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Brilliant. So now that we've introduced everyone who's going to be in the conversation now, I want to just give you a bit of guidance as to how we're going to conduct our session today. We are using the chat and the Q&A function for this webinar. Please continue to use the chat to engage with each other in the chat as guests from across the world. You can respond to things, you can react, you can share what resonates with you, engage with us generally through the chat function on your screen. And if you want to pose a question that goes to one of our panelists, please use the Q&A function as well on your screen. It allows us to organize and segment questions that will be accessible to everyone else. So we're looking forward to a very healthy conversation over the course of the next hour, thereabouts. We're going to have our webinar in about 2 sections. We will begin with a general conversation between myself and our panelists, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience as well. And we're asking you to please build your questions as you go. At any point, you can feel free to share a question for the panelists, and I will organize them for them. We've planned about a 90-minute webinar, so we have ample time to get into the conversation and also to chat with you. And so we're looking forward to that. We're also broadcasting this webinar live on Zoom as well as on social media channels for UWC. You will have access to these recordings later, and you'll be able to reshare them or listen again. With all that said, I would love to get into the conversation. And permit me to begin with Gina. Your role is one that excites me a lot because you crisscross the worlds of education and policy, and responsible AI as a framing might be seen as a paradox. Is it possible for AI to be responsible? Or how have you, in your work, begun to see AI shaping society? And generally, what is your view on the possibility of AI doing good for our world?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me. So I think the question is, can we get to responsible AI? And the answer is we must, that there really is no alternative here. The challenges are, where are decisions about AI being made? Who is making those, and how are those decisions being made? That we're going through a major transformation. That's pretty clear. We're here. I think everybody is feeling like we're in some kind of sprint that we have to keep up with. But bringing the voices into the conversation, bringing people from around the world into the conversation about what's happening in their families, in their communities, in their companies, in their societies, in their economies, that's really one of the big questions. How do we connect these questions about AI and AI development to the application of those tools in specific places with specific people? I think the second is who gets to be involved in the questions that are involved around governance. And increasingly, we're seeing governments feel like they're beholden to a set of requirements that are beyond their control. So just yesterday, I was in the House of Commons. There's a lot of questions and concerns here in the UK, whether or not even UK law will be something that lawmakers in the future will be able to uphold. So where and who get to help make democratic, accountable decisions around the ways and rules in which we govern our lives is something that's being challenged by the current state of AI. And I think finally, the question around responsibility is one of how. We've moved now from an era where we've talked about principles, really lofty ethics and principles, into the real nitty-gritty brass tacks of how are we going to do this and do this right. So I work a lot with organizations that are trying to figure out how they use AI to meet their values, solve their problems, and deliver for their customers and clients. That very critical part of what we do with these technologies and how we use them is, I think, the core of what we need to figure out when we talk about responsible AI. So the question isn't whether we should use these tools for good or if these tools could be used for good, but really where, who, and how we're going to make changes so that we ensure that they're always used for good.
That's a powerful framing, Gina. I really appreciate that. And maybe just to build on one point there, I wonder if there is just such an inherent tension. Are we right to say that there's an inherent tension between what AI can do and who holds it, who holds responsibility for it? This is a human-driven system, isn't it? How have we got here? Is there tension, or are we making much of the tension?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that we need to think about. So first, this has been framed as a race, right? A race between two of the global superpowers. A race between the US and China, and then sorry about your luck if you're not in one of those countries. I think that's an absolutely wrong framing, and it's a framing that leaves almost everybody in the world out, right? It leaves everybody else in the world out of that. I think the second bit is that we need to think about this tension around the concentration of power around these new technologies versus the rights that we have to democratic governance around choices for our lives. So, just one very concrete example, and I'm sure we're going to get into a great conversation here. The UK government put forward a proposal to make copyright laws weaker to help spark more training of AI models on British content. So think about the great corpus of English that we have in the UK. And my center at the Minderoo Center for Technology and Democracy, we did a year-long piece of work with authors around what they wanted out of a rights regime. you know, what happened was a huge outpouring. Like, you can't just take the economic products of one sector and hand them over all willy-nilly to another industry. And that's what was being put on the table because AI has been framed as a race, because we've been framing this as, well, this is the great FOMO. If we don't do exactly what AI Frontier Labs tell us to do, we will miss out. And I think what's really important, and important for the hundreds of people on this call, and the hundreds of people, the thousands of people in the UWC movement, is to remember that we can articulate a different path, and we can push for and challenge these ideas that only a handful of people get to set what the future for the planet should be.
And we're very grateful that you and others people, Gina, are having access to platforms through which you can influence both the worlds of academia and practice and research and governance as well, and policy. So we're very pleased to be able to build on this further as we carry the conversation. Now, I want to come to you and open up this space about the use case, or some of the best use cases for AI today. And you are working in one of the most consequential fields of human existence, the idea of healthcare shaping our lives. What is the use case? What is the case for AI today as you see it shaping a sector as critical as health? And how has that translated into helping you do a better job in serving the kinds of people you've committed your life to serving?
Thank you very much. So I want to start by saying that we are really at a historical moment right now. We are seeing a technology that doesn't stop before any industry anymore, unlike previous technologies that we have seen. And even healthcare can't escape that, which is a good thing on the one hand, but on the other hand, obviously brings some challenges with it. So when you think about AI in healthcare, some people think about a technology that will replace a doctor in the future. They see a robot that will start treating patients. But really, it is something that is already there in our daily lives, in the way we treat patients, in the way patients deal with healthcare themselves. So when we think about AI in healthcare, it is something that enables a patient to be more conscious about their own disease, about their own symptoms, about their own patient journey, as well as enable a doctor to deliver better care. And it starts with the patient being at home. Instead of Googling symptoms, patients start using generative AI models to discuss these symptoms and probably have better care. And then take this better prepared to a physician, where they have someone who, instead of typing all the time and documenting what the patient is saying, has time to look at the patient, to discuss with the patient in real time, while having a technology documenting the conversation and putting notes in a structured way. And then maybe also delivering an output that will be a prescription or a note that the patient can take with them, and basically deliver better care. Now, and a real use case that has been there for a really long time, which I think many people were not aware of, is AI in diagnostics, like in imaging. Radiology images have been have been diagnosed with AI basically for a really long time. Since COVID happened, this is a basic technology in most radiology units, and then even in pathology as well. Why is that helpful? It is helpful because obviously it helps like experienced doctors to deliver better care, but also to have a second opinion, a third opinion when you are not sure. For a fun fact, there are studies that show that there is a high inter and even intra-observer variability in several diagnostic fields, for example, pathology images for liver disease. So this is a great field. And then if we take it further, looking into the future, where will AI help us? So apart from diagnostics, apart from the documenting workload, that is a huge load taken off physicians' back. When we think about the future of AI in healthcare, we can think about a more preventative focused healthcare. Many of us are wearing wearables. We have tons of data that we are documenting every day, that we're carrying with us. When we take all this data, obviously, with patient agreements, etc. But we can use all this data to deliver future-oriented preventative care, and that thereby improving patients' lives, less hospitalizations of chronically ill patients, etc. Because we see deteriorations earlier, we can see how medications work, we can deliver better focused care.
Nat, I really appreciate the framing, and the first thing that began to come to mind as you were sharing some of these wonderful use cases is one of the, I'd say, the longest running understandings in the healthcare world, which is doctor-patient confidentiality, right? This legal and ethical commitment that binds healthcare professionals to keep all health information private about their patients. Is there an inherent tension in AI helping a doctor focus on the patient and less on note taking when the doctor brings a technological tool into a very private space with a patient? How do you see that tension or that reality?
It is definitely there. And one aspect that is probably connected to this is who is building these products for healthcare and who is part of the conversation when it comes to tech appliances in the hospital. And I think this is a fundamental question that we have to think of and that we have to address. Who are the people that shape the use of AI in healthcare? Is it us medical professionals who know the pain points, who know how patient-doctor conversations work, and where patients really focus on? I think patients are really open to this, to AI being used, obviously only by being sure of full transparency. They have to be informed about what is happening. They are happy to see someone looking them in the face and not just typing. But really, we have to be aware of the points of development and who is building these products. Is it the big players? Is it politics driven? Or is it something that is inherently built for a better healthcare system to deliver better care, not only in those systems where we already have great healthcare and developed healthcare, or maybe also using these technologies to serve underserved areas and communities, because this is a technology that will enable us to do so.
Can we come in a little bit more on just your personal work? I want to hear a bit about X Medical and how AI has helped you become a better, consultant to your patients when they come to you. How are you currently using AI in your practice?
So obviously there are tools, but I think the greatest part is enabling patients to use AI better. I've just had a conversation today with a patient who brought a summary and told me he had already discussed his labs and the situation with AI. And I asked him which AI he used and what his input was. And just by asking these questions, I was able to give him some more instructions. And we talked a little bit about prompt engineering and how he can use these skills to have a better output eventually. Obviously, you always have to inform patients that these are not medical devices, but they are using it. And instead of using it in an uneducated way, you can help them. So I told the patient to basically inform that LLM of what it was capable of, that it was an expert hepatologist in the field of XYZ. And the patient was very grateful, actually. So I think this is something that we'll be facing more and more. And as physicians, we need to understand this technology in order to be able to add this information to patients so they can be more informed and better taken care of.
Thank you so much, Nada. It's a whole new world, and we have to learn to navigate it together. Really grateful for the work that you're doing, and we'll have a chance to build a bit more of this conversation in. Philipp, I want to come to you and think about how your students are helping you think about how to teach responsible AI. Right, because you're a professor of AI ethics and you're helping students understand how to navigate the world, but I'm sure they're also influencing how you reflect on your own expertise, on your own teaching. What are you seeing in the classroom today that's influencing the way you think about the education around AI?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Faith, and maybe again also to UWC for convening this timely conversation, also focusing on education, which I think is really crucial. So I think you have to say I come to this question from several perspectives as a sort of practicing neurologist, a neuroscientist, as a researcher, and now also as an educator. And across these roles, I would say the connecting part is that I study and I try to also teach what happens when sort of AI, other digital technologies enter areas of profound human vulnerability, healthcare, mental health, work a lot on neurotechnology, decisions concerning the brain. And I would say basic position that I operate from is that we cannot treat AI simply as a sort of technical product that is developed first and then maybe governed later, but it's a system that is also social and institutional because it redistributes knowledge, power, also opportunities and risks comes with the innovation dynamics. And it also influences the way we develop it and deploy it, also influences who is heard, who is classified, and who receives care, or who's held responsible when something goes wrong. So I think responsible AI cannot be achieved by engineers, companies, or regulators acting in isolation, but requires highly inclusive, genuinely participatory development because the people affected by a system, like in my sector, healthcare, patients, families, but also healthcare professionals, right? The way changes work in the healthcare sector, teachers, students, they have to have some influence on the goals, the design, the evaluation, and the condition under which we deploy certain AI systems. Problem is that participation often doesn't go beyond, consultation after important decisions have already been made. So we have to include spaces, opportunities, give the ability to question whether a system should be built at all, to not operate from a sort of techno-deterministic position in which we already accept that the only solution for complicated social problems like shortage of care workers will automatically be AI or other technical systems. This kind of technological determinism can also be dangerous. And this is why I try to also teach with the students that a human rights-based approach is maybe important because it provides an essential foundation in terms of value alignment. We have rights such as dignity, privacy, equality, non-discrimination that widely apply, that are universal in many ways. And they can help us determine what socially beneficial innovation actually looks like and might mean across many different contexts. So in teaching, I try to take a very experimental and experiential approach. So students do not learn about abstract ethical principles only. They actively have to stress test AI systems. So they conduct red teaming exercises, role play, as patients, clinicians, developers, regulators, or members of a marginalized community to deliberately search for unsafe advice, hidden assumptions, biases, discriminatory outcomes, for example, in large language models. I call this adversarial teaching or adversarial exercises because they can teach an important lesson that critical engagement with AI is not obstruction or slowing down innovation, but a form of sort of active care and civic duty, if you will. Because only if we learn how to challenge a system, we can also learn how to govern it responsibly, I would say. So in that sense, I would say that this is also a question of global justice. For example, in my own field of brain health, of neurology, we have this notion now of global brain health, right? That brain health is not only shaped by diagnostic procedures, clinical aspects, but education, nutrition, environmental conditions have huge impact on brain health, for example, but also social stability, poverty as a factor, infectious diseases, climate change, and so forth. This is like the broader connection to One Health, right? Human health, animal health, planetary health that we now increasingly recognize as interdependent. And I could, if I have to point out a positive aspect of AI, maybe AI could also help us to understand these connections between these very complex systems like human health, animal health, planetary health, and better respond to these challenges. But then again, it could also reinforce extractive data practices, divert scarce resources, or deepen inequalities. And so we'll have to see. But I hope that education helps because we do not remain passive users of AI, but can become informed, courageous co-shapers, which is like the motto, I think, for the session today. So yeah.
Very helpful, Philipp. And I think we're trying to optimize for all these healthy situations for humans, for the planet, etc. Is there an absolute no-go area as we chase this optimal use cases for AI? We want to maximize every possible benefit for it. Is there an absolute no-go that you see? You talked about techno-determinism not being a thing. We shouldn't assume that we're doomed to follow the technology. We can shape it. Where do you draw the line in terms of what humans should do or not do?
Yeah, I think it's not up to me, but us as a global community and as a society to determine what those red lines are, because they are socially, culturally, politically contingent. We have now in the EU a risk-based approach to governing AI that is widely accepted, where we have introduced a system of low, medium, high risk, but also have identified uses of AI that we deem to be unacceptable because they may balance between risks and benefits clearly tilts one way. So discriminatory practices, AI-based facial recognition, AI that violates human dignity in profound ways. I think there are many instances and contexts in which we as societies might agree that there's a clear red line. But this needs also to be discussed and deliberated in a public forum in democratic ways with wide participation of everyone as much as possible, citizens, other stakeholders. And so this is yet to be determined, but I think unleashing AI without having these guardrails or without agreeing on the red lines could also be profoundly misguided.
Appreciate that, Philipp. One can say the genie is out of the bottle already. We're now dealing with this in real time, so I think we'll look to get some clearer guidance from everyone on the panel about how we should think about our role in co-shaping the future of our planet with AI. I'll come back to you on this one. Let me bring in Liha finally to bring us up to speed with where the world is going today. Liha, you've just finished an extensive research journey, and I hope you've come to some conclusions on your own, about how the development of AI can be done more responsibly. To put the framing back of this webinar, AI is shaping our world. Who gets to shape what comes next? And you've been doing some research about just the responsible development of AI systems. What is your research telling you about what is possible about responsibly developing AI?
Yeah, so I think in general, my research has pointed a lot towards the issues surrounding concentration of power, which I think reflects a lot of the common themes that a lot of the panelists have already brought up in terms of who is actually making meaningful steps towards how these technologies are being governed. And for example, my area of research right now is in the military and national security. And obviously, when you have an actor that has a monopoly on violence and they're potentially integrating these systems into the highest stakes context, there is a very wide range of concerns about whose values are actually being represented and how these technologies are being governed and how these policies are shaped. And overall, I think my research really points towards a direction of how important pluralism is, especially in today's day and age, where, for example, the damage towards the environment has a disproportionate impact on certain populations more than others. Um, Even the people that are working towards labeling data to train these models. They work in terrible work conditions. And these are things that we don't really consider when we just have ChatGPT or Claude open on our laptops. And I really do think that it's a matter of thinking deeply about how these technologies are created, who gets to shape how they are used and implemented in the world, and how this affects people outside of like the bubble of perhaps how the bubble of perhaps like the people around us. And I think in general, I feel optimistic. I'm sitting in an office where many people care about these issues. There are maybe 150 people here who are working towards the responsible development of these technologies. And I think it can be optimistic, but we just have to be very, very aware of how quickly power can get concentrated in very small numbers of actors.
Thank you so much, Leah. I want to make it a little bit more personal because you're the one who's at the closest to a UWC education in that it's not super, super long you graduated from a UWC school. I'm just wondering, how did you begin to use AI personally? And in what ways has your UWC education influenced the ways you've approached the AI tools? I'm asking this for you looking in retrospect now, knowing what AI safety looks like. I'm just wondering if you can balance the tensions of your personal journey with beginning to use AI and how you think about the use of AI today with what you also know about the safety considerations around AI.
Yeah, I mean, don't let my teachers know about the first time I ever heard of ChatGPT was in a GloPo class in AC. I remember the whispers around the classroom of, "Oh, have you heard of this new AI thing?" And the way I started using it was so I have a background in international relations. A big reason why I studied it at university was because of the teaching at Atlantic on how, especially with global politics. And I remember studying for my final IB exams, and I just thought, I want to itch the scratch that I have to learn more and more about these theories or like schools of thought. And I had this thing on my laptop, and I started talking to it. And obviously, I could have asked for resources from my teacher, and probably some of the information that ChatGPT was giving me was false, but I was just able to sit there and talk to this thing, and it would explain to me these far-fetched theories that I had never heard of, these schools of thoughts that I had never heard of. And I did end up using some of it in my exam, which probably isn't the greatest because like um it could have been wrong. But the core aspect of what like AI represents to me, and I think to a lot of young people as well, especially within my university at LSE, is how useful it is as a tool for learning. And I think going to Atlanta College was really eye opening in that I've had the privilege of being in extremely vibrant and diverse area surroundings for most of my teenage to young adult life. And this really puts into perspective how different people's values can be and what we actually represent in in the responsible development and governance of these systems. And for example, LSE, a lot of my second and third year courses ended up becoming um, exam based instead of course based because they weren't sure how to deal with the AI, the potential use of AI in our coursework. And on the other hand, I had a data science course that completely encouraged us to use AI because this is what the industry trends were looking like with software engineers and coders actually using these tools in their everyday workflows. And I think While it is appropriate that our assessments and our education is going to be changing as these technologies emerge, I also think that it's important to consider, for example, somebody who might not have the resources to pursue private tutoring in a very difficult metric class, to have this thing be able to help them out with problem sets weekly versus banning it outright and saying that any type of work that is influenced by these technologies is going to be like given a zero, basically. And I think it's a really tricky conversation to be had. And I've had some conversations with my teachers at LSE about how we could approach this, but I don't think there is a a coherent narrative about how we should be approaching these types of things.
Thank you. You're just one of us. We're all trying to figure this thing out, and I think it's great to hear just a real experience of what it's like to be managing these tensions in a personal and professional space. Let me come all the way back to Gina, because I'm really curious about how the people who we believe have the highest power to influence the direction of AI, which is governments, how are governments really thinking about AI from a safety, responsibility, regulations point of view? We surely can't leave it to the tech leaders to figure this out for us. So, from what you're seeing, how are governments, or how's the Welsh government, the British government, how are people thinking about their responsibility for shaping the use of AI in our world?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is really mixed, and it really depends on the different capabilities that governments around the world have. So, um, what we've seen, for example, in the U.S. government. So, the U.S. government pre 2024 released an AI Bill of Rights. What would bringing that human rights perspective to AI look like? Very detailed procurement questions. So, how should government be a buyer of AI-enabled services? And I just want to make a mention to the really good point that was raised in the Q&A already, that we're talking about very different systems, right? So, large language model, chat-based, frontier labs versus analytics of government-held data. So there's different kinds of tools and services we're talking about. I would say there's three, maybe four commonalities that we see. One is this question that we've danced around in our discussion today, which is around safety, right? How governments have a role to keep people safe. There is increasingly a question around what's the relationship between AI-powered cyber attacks, AI-powered information and cognitive warfare challenges, AI used by state actors against other state actors, right? So we've seen since the AI summit, the first AI summit that happened at the historical home of computing in the UK at Bletchley Park. From the Bletchley AI Summit, we've seen governments really kind of think about what does this mean for safety and security questions. I think the second thing in terms of that is, governments ensure fair markets. They pick up in market failures. It's not just about securing those borders and national defense, but there's other functions of government, right? And in the kinds of ways that we think about AI and the transformation on societies, I would say government's responses are fairly mixed. We've seen, just this week, for example, in the UK, we've got one of the most advanced AI security teams in the world. With the changes in the US administration in 2024, they really ramped down and dismantled some of their AI security and AI defense related issues, moved them into different pockets. So no longer had a team with national standards and securities that was working on specifically AI safety. The UK government picked up that slack, had a world leading AI safety team, still has a great security team. They've just this week, it's been reported that they've absorbed, let go, dismissed the team working on AI and societal resilience. So all of these questions that we have around how is AI making child pornography more prevalent? How is AI powering financial, a deepfake financial fraud and scams? A piece of work my team has done work on. How is AI supercharging online misogyny and hate? How is AI helping to create new ways that we do, social disorder, right? So we're having a really hard time thinking about what do governments do? And then the third way, and we'll sum this up, the third way that governments are thinking about AI is really how do they make the delivery of government services more efficient. And I think this is one of the most intoxicating but potentially dangerous ways that governments are thinking about AI, because um, I like to talk about it as like sprinkling the AI magic dust over really big problems of delivering the services of government. So, yes, governments around the world want public services delivered to their citizens in the most efficient way possible. Making that transformation isn't just about using one of these AI chatbots or one of these products to do that. So there's really deep work for governments to do on each of those. And that's not even getting into helping people recognize and understand their transition. I mean, we've not even talked about jobs yet in this panel. Like what is happening to the future of work? So, massive role for governments to play. And governments, I would judge them to be slightly on the back foot when it comes to that. So, final point is, I joined a group of over 250 economists and others, really calling on governments around the world to start doing work on the economic transition. We're not yet seeing the kind of leadership we expect around what work of the future will look like. And that's something I think we really need to be and take care of.
So there's a lot of warnings and, hopefully not alarm bells, but there's a lot of warnings in what you're talking about because a lot of us put our hopes in governments. We look up to governments hoping they're thinking about us, they're planning for us, they're going to have our backs. Are you hopeful at all? You look, and maybe it's not such a trick question, but like just looking for where do you draw your hope from in terms of the capacity in governments today to look out for people, or will the tech overrun every capacity in government today to lead us in a path we
Mm.
might not want to go? Do you think we can collectively, with all the will in the world, can we get this right? Or are we somewhat at the mercy of the technology?
I'm going to quote a member of the House of Lords here in the UK, Baroness Beeben Kidron, who is just she's a filmmaker by trade. She is a firecracker. I don't know that we deserve her leadership. She's so incredible. Um, in a closed door session we had yesterday, she said tech accountability is one of the most pressing problems of democracy, right? So, just to kind of pick that apart, we have the most rapidly growing technological transformation that humanity's ever seen, being led by some of the most financially concentrated companies, the greatest, sheerest concentration of wealth that humanity has ever seen, in a planet dealing with some of the biggest challenges we have ever faced since the Anthropocene. And we have a group of companies that are saying, don't worry, just trust us. We will let us do all the work here. That's a problem because it cuts too many of us in too many places out of the work of figuring out what futures we want. And when we see from Kenya to Kentucky, when we see people saying, this is not what we want, but they can't figure out how to push back against big tech, then we know we have a problem. We have a problem with democratic accountability. And that's what I think we really need to be working on.
This is super helpful. It's like we've got to sit into like a peek into the window of what really is happening behind all this massive walls of government. And I think it really is a challenge for democracy because democracy really should be a government of the people, by the people, as they say, right? We should feel like we have some agency. And I hope we somewhat discover our agency in this role. Let me bring Nada back into the conversation because I'm keen to get back into the real use cases you're seeing. I wondered if you could actually maybe share something from your practice about where you have seen the balance of AI and healthcare being really well done in your practice in a way that maybe has served the need or of a patient of yours, something from your practice that brings us home, really well to us to say, look, this thing is working and we're able somewhat to strike the right balance in terms of how we invite people to use it well, not just the random, check your symptoms and all that, which I think is a great starting point. But as you go past that, is AI really changing your industry in a good way? And are people feeling the benefits of that?
So the short answer is yes. If we start looking into the field of research where AI is enabling a lot faster studies, drug development is easier to do. We are able um, to start doing studies for really rare diseases by amplifying patient numbers, etc. So this is definitely a big yes. In daily medical life, we are using AI for preclinical triage in online systems, which is very helpful. So by navigating patients to the right place and ensuring they get the right treatment. There is better scheduling, which obviously eases doctors' lives, etc. Obviously, there are also dangers. Patients using AI without any oversights, seeking treatments, which is good and bad at the same time. Like I mentioned before, it is good if patients know how to use the tools because they have physicians who can enable them to use them better. But on the other hand, also AI LLMs are not clinicians, they are not therapists, which patients sometimes start to feel they are. If we look at using AI in medicine, I think using AI responsibly can only be ensured through AI literacy. And when we look at the medical field and AI, I think it is really important to treat AI just as another expert in the room, just as another tool. And when we usually start using new tools as clinicians, there is a training. You are basically introduced into using a scalpel, you are introduced to using an endoscope. And this is something that we have to be well aware of when we think about AI. We currently have numbers stating that 80% of doctors use shadow AI, that is, tools that are not really made for the clinical world, and thus are risking unsafe and unsustainable use of AI. And I think this is something that we should really well aware of. And I think this was also a question in the Q&A, is AI really something that can be used in education? So right now there is the discussion of de-skilling and never skilling in medicine, which is obviously a very important conversation to have. Are we losing skills that are necessary? Is it still a good decision to study medicine in the future world? And I would definitely say yes. So for medicine, we will always have to have doctors. We will always have to have people who are able to treat patients, no matter where they are. Is it in the Sahara? Is it in deep winter? Is it in times where we have great connection? Is it in times where we don't have any internet at all? There will always have to be a good medical treatment. Still, AI will definitely cause a reskilling. It will disrupt the way we study, the way we learn. And there I like to always draw the parallel to the aviation world. Pilots are really one of the best trained people in the world to do their job, while their job is 90% autopilot. But they're trained for those 5 to 10% where something goes wrong, where there is an emergency situation where they have to kick in and where they have to be 100% present. And this will also affect us in medicine. So we will continue to learn the way we do, and then use AI to amplify our work, to basically support us in our daily life. And then to get back to the initial question, the documentation load, the memorizing load, the summaries, etc. This is obviously something that we have to know how to do, but this is something that is load taken off, where we can focus really on the treatment. So again, yes, it it does change the way we practice medicine and is really, yeah.
That's very helpful. And for you as a medical practitioner, uh, does the use of various AI tools, and I'm sure there are specialized tools for AI in medicine, does it give you comfort that you've got backup somewhat, that you don't have to rely on all of your training exclusively when you come into your practice? Do you feel more confident? Are you able to trust what you're getting in a way that helps you do your job better?
I would love to say yes and answer yes to that question. Unfortunately, currently there are not enough validated tools that are really used in daily clinical life. There is a lot of studies going on where AI tools are used. So apart from the scribing, documenting tools, but from the radiology imaging support that I've talked about, yes, there is support in endoscopy where polyps are recognized through AI. But like for every part of the conversation, unfortunately, I do not see the support I would love to see. But this comfort net, this safety net, is something that I see as one of the first implementations that we should focus on, not as something that will replace us, but as something that will tell us, hey, there's something you missed. There is a red flag. And this is something that we should be running in the background because doctors make mistakes, even if we don't like to admit that.
Think we now know they do, which we wish we didn't know, right? But now we
Yeah,
know. What I'm hearing is a call for people who are willing to help to shape the future of AI for healthcare to kind of get going because we need this and we need people to help to make it right and also hold the balance, of course, of responsibility. Thanks a lot.
absolutely.
Thanks a lot. Phil, I think one of the questions that has been most prevalent in the world of education and for everyone who's dealing with young people is this cognitive weight that we think is shifting for young people. Lots of alarm bells around, lots of critical reasoning for young people just learning to follow the AI, not so much as, learning for themselves. What skills are we going to lose? What competencies will we lose if we all just follow the AI? Given what you know about neurology and the brain and how young people grow and all of that, are you as concerned as people claim we should be about how AI would change the way we learn, the way we live, change here being negatively? Are you worried about where AI is taking us as a species?
I would say I'm generally worried, but at the same time, in my role and identity as a scientist, I would also emphasize that this points to the need, or that we have to recognize that we now have a historic responsibility to actually study the effects of this rapid deployment of, say, generative AI, LLMs, on cognitive abilities, moral reasoning, emotional processing, at a scale that is commensurate with the rapid innovation dynamics. Because as an analogy, we kind of missed the train as it left the station on mental health and social media. We are now living in a situation in which many governments are already taking strong actions in terms of social media bans for children and adolescents, because we recognize that they might be especially vulnerable in terms of brain development, but also development of their self-image, in terms of mental health. So we have a lot of fragmented data now on the impact of social media on mental health and well-being of children and adolescents, but we kind of missed the opportunity to do really high quality, large scale, population level studies on this question. And we should not make the same mistake now as LLMs, other forms of AI are used in all contexts, all sectors of society, especially in education. So this would be an urgent call to action to governments to really put a lot of resources into funding these kinds of studies. One could take a precautionary stance from a regulatory perspective and say we have maybe emerging preliminary evidence that there are effects on critical thinking skills, reasoning skills that could justify a ban on LLMs in certain educational contexts for certain age groups. But we also have to be mindful of the opportunities that we are taking away from children. So in the social media case, for every mental health damage that you prevent by keeping kids off Instagram, TikTok, and other social media, you are also keeping away maybe the 15-year-old environmentalist, queer activist that is using social media as a platform, and is only maybe their only real platform for self-actualization and community. So again, very difficult trade-off. I think there's reason to be worried around critical thinking skills, education, psychological development, but we have to do the science in order to be able to make rational, evidence-based and science-based decision at the policy level. And I don't see this happening at the moment, so there's very urgent call to action to make these kinds of studies.
I think that sounds exactly spot on. Just a balance between what AI can do for young people in this age and also how to safeguard young people responsibly going forward. There's maybe not so much of a middle ground. It's all context based. Liha, let me actually bring you in here. How have you lived with this perception of how AI impacts young people today? We read the every now and then the really alarming articles, about how a person fell in love with an AI companion, to their own detriment. Is that something you're hearing from your peer group, from other young, are people dealing with this the way every now and then we hear in the news people are grappling with it? Do you experience that as well?
I would say in terms of, so my opinion on this is that I think my generation, so I only got access to AI when I was about 18. And I think I've had the privilege of, having gone through quite a bit of my formative education at that point and having developed some of the critical thinking skills to deal with this. And I think what myself and a lot of my peers are thinking about is, okay, AI is a huge aspect of our workflows from a day to day point of view. Like at school, or at university, a lot of the ways that I'm using AI and a lot of my friends are using AI, especially for things like dissertations and essays, is to help us brainstorm. So we'll put all of our ideas into a chatbot and say, okay, here are all of my ideas. Can you chat with me and help me tease out some of these and elaborate on some of these? And, or you'll read the response, go back and say, well, okay, well, what do you think about this? And this is how my idea has been playing out. And a lot of, I think, what people around me are concerned about is this taking away some of our critical thinking skills? Instead of talking to my fellow classmates now on an essay that we all have to write, I'm predominantly talking to this chatbot, which at the end of the day is a machine that predicts the most likely next word, right? As much as we can assume that these things have intelligence, a lot of it is just a machine learning algorithm. Um, so that's one aspect. The other aspect is obviously the job market, which other panelists have also brought up. I think it's a scary time for everyone, but especially being a new grad, it is really tough out here, especially because you hear these stories about people who are able to, code agents who go out and fill out really terrible applications, and they fill out they apply to 10,000 jobs at a time, for example. And then you just wonder okay, well, I'm sending out all these applications. The likelihood is that they're probably going to be screened by an AI system by these companies before I even get to an interview. What is the point? So I think those are the two main things that myself and other people around me are grappling with. But obviously I can't really speak on maybe younger children and how they're dealing with an increasingly difficult information environment to navigate with AI slop and AI generated images and anything like that.
That sounds just right. Let me pose a question differently. Is there any question you would ask to our other panelists, just given what we've discussed today? Who do you want to pose a challenging one to?
I don't want to challenge anyone, but I guess on the topic of young people, I think a question that myself and a lot of other people have is, well, I think young people are constantly told to get a seat at the table, to have your voice out there, but it sort of feels like this conversation is dominated by a lot of technocrats or like policymakers, government actors, a lot of business people. So I'd love like the panelists' views on what does meaningful participation actually look like for someone entering the field who might want to be part of the conversations about how these technologies are governed.
It's a great question. Who wants to give a stab at it? Actually, Gina, are there any young people in the rooms where you sit?
Yeah, I just thought of this great example as you were asking that question, Leah. It's so during the AI summits, which were very and still are quite formalized. Um, the first one at Bletchley Park had, I'm going to say 100 people in the room, right? It was really tightly controlled, very, global experts. The UN has spun up these similar kinds of great and important working groups, but they are not for people who are starting in their careers. What we did was organize a fringe event, and the AI fringe has become a key part of the summit process in the AI summits. And I have to say that was the first, second, and third one um, were the best events I've ever been to for bringing those kind of diverse people and their voices into the room. So I would say first to any young person, look for those spaces where you can both hone your own skills and talking to other people about what's important. Find those opportunities where you can make your voices heard. For example, government consultations, UN consultations, they seem complicated, but we just did one on young people in the social media ban in the UK, and it's great when we can get young people saying, this is what we think and what we believe. And third, band together with other young people. I think this is one of the best ways that you can both learn the work of informing and influencing policy, but also, as you said, build those connections with other people. It's also something for those of you from UWC experience, it's also something we learned to do at UWC, right? It was encouraged in our classrooms and encouraged in how we think and view the world. So I would say, don't let um, your voice is really important because your experience in governing this technology is important. And that's what we need to keep in mind and keep in focus.
This is brilliant. It's great to just have two UWCs from different generations, sharing this space together and trying to grapple with our shared reality about how we shape, because we invite young people to believe that they can contribute towards shaping a better future for us and want them to use their education to take the right actions to shape that better future. But if they're not in the right rooms and if they're not being invited into those rooms or helped to actually see what's possible, we're doing them a disservice. So, Gina, I'm hoping you'll bring Liha along to one of your next sessions because I think that'll be just magic. But I'll let that happen in the post conversation. We have several people around the world who have joined us today, and I'm just so grateful for everyone who's stayed so far in the conversation and dropped lots of questions into the Q&A for us. So I'd like to dip into that a little bit and then open up for much more discussions from people. And I'll start with something that I think is top on people's minds, and I want to go environmental. There's a question here from Michael around how are the environmental and social justice impacts of data centers, which is really the platform on which the AI tools, depend. How is that consistent with our value system, our mission? How do we square this circle? Gina, it might have been you or someone else who was sharing when we had this conversation about, just data centers taking up so much environmental power. How should we think about this in the world in which we live? We can't stay silent really about just how much water and energy AI is consuming, in as much as we're excited for it. How should we think about it? Gina might start, anyone else might just jump in.
I'll give the panel a time to think and jump into, but I just want to say, let's be aware that we all have individually an incredible and significant role to play, and there are limits to our individual action. So solving the environmental problem of AI is a collective problem, right? We have to come together and work together. I think we do that through legislation and regulation. My center released a report about a year ago, July 2025, precisely a year ago, on a sweltering day in the House of Lords here in the UK. And the temperature was so hot for the UK that our trains were delayed and canceled. Like we were literally running thanks to a good Samaritan. We got a ride halfway to the House of Lords and we were like running the rest of the way. Um, the thing that we called out was that we know from the US securities law required environmental reporting, the environmental impact statements of big tech companies. We know they're blowing through their environmental impact commitments. We know they're blowing through their net zero goals. We know the reason for this is AI. We know that because they're saying it in these really obscure documents. But then they come into these rooms and they say, don't worry, we're going to build your data center, but we're going to only use green power. That happened here in the UK. It happened in the Netherlands. It's happened around the world. And then they say, whoopsie, we can't get enough power. We can't get enough electricity. Oh, by the way, we're going to use gas powered generators to power these data centers. Or we would love to use solar. Really, we would. But, data centers need to run 24/7. And unfortunately, the sun doesn't run all the time. So, whoopsie, we're going to have to come up with alternate plans. I think as individuals, we have to really be active at pushing our governments to hold these companies to account. I don't think the solution is saying absolutely no AI, let's be Luddites. I don't think that gets us to where we want to go. I also don't think that as individuals we get to a sustainable future simply by saying, well, I'm not going to use ChatGPT. Like, I think we've got to come up with better solutions. So some of those are mandatory reporting of data center electricity use. Sounds really geeky, but it's exactly what we need to be doing in every single country and every single jurisdiction. We're seeing in the US, for example, data center sightings. I could really geek out on this topic, by the way. We're seeing data center sightings in places that have less political power. We who have some political power, including young people, we need to be making sure that we mobilize and say, just because Louisiana doesn't have the capacity to push back right now because they feel like they can't say no to the jobs, we need to make sure that we're writing in those things that benefit those communities. And again, tying those benefits, it's the who and it's the where and it's the how. Tying the benefits to the AI powered moment to benefits for local communities, right? We're not just going to push the costs and the harms onto the communities sitting beside data centers. We need to make sure that those communities benefit from and reap the gains as well.
Super, super, super helpful. Go for it, Philipp.
Yeah, maybe just speaking to this, but also maybe adding a little bit to this point, like what can, young people, students do. And I would say you can take the analogy with climate action and how young people responded to the sort of challenge from climate change, and seeing that perhaps political processes were not adequately responding to the perceived urgency, to the reality of what was happening. And I think in terms of collective action, grassroots movements, and bottom-up action, this is actually, possibly inspiring or maybe dispiriting, depending on your perspective, lesson, but at least shows that if young people get together around a cause that is important to them and that concerns them, they have a lot of voice and power and come together in meaningful ways. In our own work, we work a lot with communities, people living with disabilities. And there's this great slogan from the disability studies, the 60s, 70s, nothing about us without us. And I think that could also lead student action to say, AI is all about us because it concerns our own future work, environment, labor, how that is shaped. It concerns our education. It maybe even impacts our planet, getting back to the question of data centers and the energy use. And so this is all about us. And this is why we have to have a seat at the table, a voice in this process. And so maybe the model around climate action can be inspiring in that sense.
That's great. I think one more thing that people have been really worried about for, a bit more discerning is the actual cost of AI. And I think people are kind of worried today that with the big LLMs that we're using today, that those who are now paying for the pro tools, if you like, that even what we are paying is a pittance compared to what it's costing the AI companies to develop this solution. So I'm wondering, will the day come when we can begin a shift towards more affordable community-driven AI? This is a question, by the way, from Delphine Menard in the chat, asking, is there a future for open community-driven AI tools that is developed as a public resource rather than one that's owned by large corporations, kind of the way Wikipedia emerged as, is that somewhere down the horizon, or is this thing such an expensive tool that can then again separate the haves from the have-nots and breed future inequalities in the world? And how do you see this landscape shaping up?
I'll jump in on that, and a little shout out to my classmate Delphine. Hi, Delphine. Um,
Wonderful.
and a long term who is also a long-term Wikipedian, has been very involved in the wiki movement. Listen, this moment of our AI development has been painted as the last one, right? That there is, if we are to listen to today's leaders in the marketplace, that they're on a race to get some kind of all-powerful AI, and that it'll be over. Like humanity will be, to listen to some of them, humanity will be over, and there will be no more AI development, right? We'll just have these super smart AGIs who will run everything, and we'll all be out of jobs, and the world will be terrible. Um, there are a lot of people who don't believe that technically, right? So, and as Delphine knows, and as some of you know on the call, there are different approaches rather than this large language model approach. So, as we know, there are open source Chinese models that have been proving incredibly capable. There's also an enormous amount of development that's come out of the AI Summit world. So Cohere and two kinds of initiatives that came out of the Paris model have been really working on developing these open source tools. And then I would say that there's a complete other I'm going to use the word languages. There's complete other approaches. So the world model approach that's being developed in different ways by Jan LeCun, who used to be at Meta, and Fei Li, who is at Stanford, who brought us ImageNet. They both think that this LLM moment that we're in has limits. Like we'll only get so far in the development of that. So the idea that we will continue to develop our tools in the most computationally expensive way possible is not necessarily the future that we're going to have. And I'll just underscore this and open it up to the rest of the panel. I mean, I think the future will be saved by Wikipedians, right? I really do think that librarians and Wikipedians working hand in hand will protect us from some kind of global information integrity apocalypse. And that we've got this capacity and model to think about what other kinds of ways that we could be building AI that actually works in services of people. So again, that's a collective action problem. It's not just for individuals, but it's going to take all of us.
Oof. Okay, we got a marching orders, people. We have to do something about this one. Um, let me come to Liha. You made a point in your talk about just how AI could potentially reinforce some form of exploitation, and I'm just wondering, does the growth of AI as it is emerging today with what you're seeing, does that reinforce some of the existing forms of exploitation in the world? And this is a question that came from Ali Alagele in the chat. And if I could link another question to that, possibly, is how do we then protect human creativity and intellectual property in this era where it's really difficult to establish ownership, attribution, accountability? If we just let things continue the way they are, how do we protect the best of ourselves and how do we avoid exploiting the wrong people?
Yeah, I think I have 2 points to make here. Firstly, on the I have a little bit of a legal background, but like not great. But on the IP and copyright aspects, I am of the opinion that that was potentially passed as a result of the UK Opportunities Plan, UK AI Opportunities Plan. And from my impression, it seems that the UK is trying to insert itself into like the value chain of AI because they don't have a domestic company to compete with the American ones, right? So a lot of what we're seeing right now is not deregulation, but a lot of relaxing of regulation in order to attract capital and to attract further like domestic development. And this is also like potentially why we're going to start seeing, I don't know, like wacky data centers in the Midlands or something. So I think when those types of competitive dynamics come into play, it's quite difficult for us to say, okay, how do we balance our human creativity and what's good for us and what these large corporations that are honestly gaining more and more power, like maybe just below what sovereign power as we know it is now, and what their demands are. And that's a question that I can't answer. And I think a lot of people are up in the air about this, of how we're going to navigate a potentially very different political system where these huge companies have a huge stake in it, especially with American politics. Um, and I think copyright is just the first wave of this, because I think historically arts have been seen as something not as important, despite the fact that it is the backbone of our entire humanity and culture as we know it today. Um, but yeah, like I think that's an open question that a lot of people are thinking about. The second point that I would say is about the exploitation aspect. I think one of my biggest takeaways from my UWC experience is the specific line education for good. And I think this really puts into perspective how we can harness certain movements and actions throughout our lives for the purpose of good. I believe that AI can be a force of good. I think that it can democratize access to information. I believe that it could potentially, I don't know, like make it easier for people to get information about how to get a job or something like that. And I think the issue here is that we're already seeing this divide between like the global south and the global north in terms of like what technology they're able to access. In order to have access to ChatGPT or Claude or your Geminis, you need to have internet access and you need to have technology infrastructure. That is not equally applied throughout the world. And I think assuming that AI, as it is, allowing it to continue on as it is today, will not create like a further divide purely because this is a democratizing force is like a little bit naive. Because I think just from the way that the world is set up and the access to internet throughout different countries, that just it will create scenarios where there are some people who really benefit from AI and some people who really won't. And I think that's also something that we have to consider in combination with the environment and education of how we're supposed to overcome this.
Interesting days ahead for all of us then. Nad, I want to come to you, and Philip might have something to add to this as well. There's a number of questions that really relate to AI and health and largely cognitive development, beginning with young people, right? So Lola Cassia Suarez is asking really about, should every school have a designated AI lead to guide responsible AI use and support educators in maintaining human oversight to ensure cognitive development? And then there's another question from Michael Urad about how can schools ensure that AI supports learning without undermining the development of foundational cognitive skills? And there's a third question, really, from Jiufeng too, which is about, can we talk more about AI and brain health? So what I'm seeing here is really this question, and I think it begins foundationally in the earliest ages for young people. There might be a risk that AI will be pushed a little bit more towards schools and going to younger kids and all of that. And even those of us who are a little bit older, we're not immune at all from this. So I'm just wondering, with your medical human health lens, what are the guardrails that you think we should be introducing in our daily lives in kindergarten, in middle school, in high school? How should we protect the future of our brains and cognitive development with AI being a lot more ubiquitous?
This is a very big question that probably Philipp will be able to elaborate on more. I think it is a very fair question to ask. And again, going back to history and looking at my own childhood, when I was young, we used to memorize phone numbers. We used to memorize calendar dates. We used to do all of that, and now all of this is in our phone. Just today, a patient was telling me, wait, I got to get out my brain. And then she took out her phone to check for her basically appointments. So this is a very fair question to ask, right? We are, again, at a point where we are seeing a technology that is able to take away a lot of cognitive load, just like electronic devices were able to take a lot of cognitive load by letting us stopping memorize phone numbers. We need AI officers or AI leads in every school and in every clinic and in every company to ensure that we still do the work that we do. And going back to the aviation example that I mentioned, 90% is AI, and still pilots are one of the best trained people and jobs in the world. We need to ensure that this development isn't completely replaced by AI. And I think it is simple to say that students still will have to learn to read, to write, etc., to discuss. And then also we'll have to have a guided approach to AI, how to use AI. And I think the most important to learn how to use AI is basically to understand how AI works. AI is not kind of a magical machine that knows everything. AI is just the data that we put in. It includes the biases that we have. It amplifies them. And this is very important to understand when we talk about using AI and learning with AI. And this is that everyone will have to take into account. I think from our basic development, nothing should change, but this can only be ensured by training the people that are our educators, that are our teachers, that are our professors. And then we have to ensure also that AI can be used in a positive way for training, for double checking, for asking questions by training, for using AI basically to very personal way of learning, because everyone is a different type of learner. And now we have the chance to give people the opportunity to learn the way they would like to learn. And this is something very positive. But this can only, again, be ensured by having the people who know how to do it and can have an oversight.
Brilliant. Philipp, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, well, actually, from a sort of evidence-based perspective, there are really easy ways to improve your brain health. Sleep, eat well, and exercise. And these are things that we can hopefully sort of all to a certain degree sort of at least strive for in our lives. But this again points to the fact that context and the circumstances under which you live will have a very important impact on your brain health. If you're living in a war zone where you're constantly under threat physically, maybe you cannot find sleep at night. If you're living in a low middle income country in which even basic food safety and security is not given, maybe these nutritional aspects have a negative impact on your brain development. And so again, I think we should first ask the question, what can we do for global brain health at scale and in a sort of social infrastructural way before we look at sort of AI in terms of cognitive enhancement and things like that. Because there's always an inherent tension between the sort of collective responsibility that we have for well-being and health as societies, as a global community, and this sort of problem of responsibilization, as sociologists call it, the notion that we put a lot of responsibility onto the individual to deal with adverse effects of technology. So in nutrition, for example, the question is like, okay, why do you eat so many sweets, right? Why don't you take better care of your weight? Instead of saying, do we have an infrastructure in which there are not a lot of incentives, in which we have sugar taxes, in which we make sure that the whole system is set up in a way that people can make better and healthier choices in their nutrition, right? And so there's always a tension of like putting too much responsibility for one's own well-being and health onto the individual, especially if an individual is already struggling with mental health issues, with socioeconomic deprivation, with poverty, with other factors that might limit their own agency or limited education, things like that. So I think overall we have a deeply political and structural responsibility to make sure that we can harness the positive opportunities from AI, say in education and healthcare, but also mitigate the risks and make sure to protect citizens against the worst effects that could happen under certain circumstances.
Super helpful. We're coming towards the end of our time. I have time for about two more questions. I'm going to come to you, Gina, because you tangentially mentioned jobs earlier, Gina. Are you aware? This is a question from Leticia de la Bianca in the chat. Are you aware of any empirical data that is showing how young people are already shifting their career choices away from certain jobs at the risk of automation? And what can we do? What would be your advice to young people who are maybe approaching the world of work now being very, very confused about where to go, how to prepare to, escape the AI that's chasing them. What are you seeing and what would you advise young people?
Yeah, I'm going to use this opportunity, of course, to make another shout out to the UWCs and the UWC movement, because the kind of education that was put in place by Kurt Weil and others, how many decades ago, is in a lot of ways what we need going forward, right? That it's community based, that it's based on these connections and relationships, that it's about learning about the world, that it's about experience and really getting very clear. And more than anything, oh my goodness, are we taught critical thinking and questioning and all of those great skills that we know AI proof people. That doesn't help when you're saying, okay, now what job am I going to do? I think the best thing we know from economists right now is that AI is quickly changing tasks and jobs are bundles of tasks. So remember, just because we may be automating away lots of particular kinds of tasks, I don't know that we're going to have loads of people writing LinkedIn posts in the future, for example. Our jobs are kind of multiple things. And if your work is about connecting, meeting, convincing, influencing people, that's not going away anytime soon. So do we have empirical evidence that people are changing? I don't know of any. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but we are starting to see that people are asking these questions. What kind of futures do we want for our young people? And this is where, and I'm going to come back, our UWC experience has taught us we can bring our leadership to bear in this. This isn't just about the choices that I make as a change agent. It's about how we learn to work together to ensure we have good futures for everybody.
This is so powerful, so powerful. Leah, I'm going to give you the final word on this one. There's a question from your fellow UWCer. Name is Jake Gates, and Jake is asking, how can schools like UWC bridge the gap between rapid AI adoption and responsible scaled use? So it sounds a little bit like Gina was already showing us the way, like we're doing this already, but here is your chance to give a final kind of like push to your alma mater and all of the UWC schools out there. What should we be doing from the lens of a recent UWC grad?
Um, wow, this is a lot of pressure to be the closer. I think on one hand, it's really, really important. And I wish this was something I had gotten throughout my university experience as well. I think it's really important to educate people about how to use these tools. Um, like I said, I think AI can be a force of good, for good, especially in education, just to make sure that people can have this thing that can serve as a tutor for you if you're not understanding a given topic or you're falling behind in your grades. I think it's a great way to democratize access to education. But I think that has to be caveated by educators. And obviously, this is a very difficult question, but I think educators have a responsibility to try and figure out how best to serve the next generation and teach them how to use this technology responsibly. It's not copy and paste this problem set into ChatGPT and ask it to solve it for you. It's more so, okay, how can you use this tool as a research assistant instead of a crutch that you can't function without? The other thing is that I think, and Gina mentioned this briefly, but I think one of my biggest takeaways from UWC is how resilient a bunch of young people can be, like when they all get together and they just have one specific goal in mind. Um, like for example, whether it was like, oh, we want more toast in our weekly house food delivery, like we'd like that, please. Or for example, I hosted a conference recently at LSE where um, we don't really have access to these types of very lofty conferences that a lot of professionals go to discuss these issues. So I hosted one. And I was like, you know what, like undergrads, like this is a conference for undergrads and for social science students. I think it's really important to spotlight like young people's voices. The motto of the conference was the generation who will live with AI should govern it. And I think that's a good closer in terms of like how we should be thinking about these issues, because AI isn't just an issue right now. It will continue to be an issue, and it's really important for us to consider it that way.
That's a powerful closer, Liha. The people who will live with AI should govern it. And power to the people, power to the young generation. Let me say a huge word of thanks to my four panelists today. This has been a rich conversation. You've all brought so much from your worlds of education and healthcare and research and policy. We began by framing, this conversation around AI is shaping our world. Who will shape it? And who gets to shape what's next? I think Liha is going to shape what's next, right? As much as Gina helps to shape it, and Philipp and that as well. So the next generation is living with this reality a lot quicker than many of us had to come into it. And I think we want to hold that responsibility together. We want to keep thinking about our role, not just as consumers of tools, not, living in a techno-deterministic world. I hadn't used that term before Philipp dropped it today, so thank you for that. Right. We are not bound to what exists. We have agency. And Jen has given us an invitation for young people to think about this as well. This is our time. Step in, think about your use. Philipp has said this could be the next wave of youth advocacy, kind of similar to how young people have taken the climate challenge as our challenge for this time. We can shape what comes next, and we must. That's what I've heard today. Thank you all so much to everyone who's joined us from all parts of the world. The recording will be live on Zoom, not on YouTube, not long after this. And we invite you to listen again, share with other people. And to everyone who is a member of the UWC movement or a friend of the UWC movement, we invite you to keep working with us to expand access to the kinds of education that Gina and Lee have talked about, spaces where young people can be challenged, inspired, encouraged to live together, learn together, serve together, and help us shape a much more peaceful and sustainable world. I wish you a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thanks so much, Faith. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you, Philipp.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the day.